The ancestors and piston pioneers. The story of American rotary flight doesn't begin with a sleek machine in a factory. It begins with a man in a fedora sitting in what looked like a metal lawn chair with a rotor on top, hovering a few feet off the ground while tied to the earth with a rope. That man was Igor Sikorsky, and the year was 1939. His machine was the VS-300, a tethered, shaking, barely controlled experiment that most people would have walked away from. But what it proved was everything. The single main rotor on top combined with a smaller tail rotor on the back was the only configuration that gave a helicopter stable, controlled flight. Every helicopter you have ever seen, heard, or ridden in traces its bloodline directly to this one machine. Without it, there is no modern aviation as we know it. But before the VS-300, the military was already experimenting with something in the same neighborhood. The Kellett KD-1 and YG-1 were autogyros. And there's an important difference. An autogyro is not a true helicopter. It has a rotor on top, but that rotor isn't powered. It spins freely in the wind, the way a pinwheel spins when you run with it. The aircraft still needed a regular propeller out front to move forward. What it gave the Army in the 1930s was the ability to take off in very short distances and fly slowly over terrain, something no fixed-wing plane could do. It wasn't hovering, but it was close enough to get military commanders thinking seriously about vertical flight. The next major leap came in 1942 with the R-4 Hoverfly, the world's first mass-produced helicopter. If you imagine a steel cage wrapped loosely in fabric with a small engine that barely had enough power to lift itself, you have the R-4. It was underpowered, uncomfortable, and fragile, but it could hover, and that one ability changed warfare. When wounded soldiers were trapped deep in the jungles of Burma, terrain so dense that no fixed-wing plane could land, the R-4 flew in, set down in a small clearing, and flew them out. It was the first time in history that a helicopter saved human lives in a combat zone. After the R-4 proved the concept, Sikorsky went back to work and produced the R-5/H-5 Dragonfly. This was a genuine upgrade. It featured a tandem cockpit, 2 seats arranged front to back, and a larger, more capable fuselage. More importantly, it started showing military planners what a utility helicopter could actually do beyond just hovering. The H-5 was used to rescue pilots who had gone down in flooded rivers and to carry stretchers mounted on the outside of the airframe. It was the first glimpse of the helicopter as a true multi-purpose tool. Alongside Sikorsky's breakthrough work came the R-6 Hoverfly 2, a refined and more streamlined version of the original R-4. It had an enclosed glass cockpit and a stronger engine, representing a clear step forward in design. Hundreds were built for World War II, proving that the early helicopter formula could be improved and mass-produced. Though it would eventually be overshadowed by the superior R-5, the R-6 validated the principle that each generation of rotary aircraft could learn from the last, a pattern that would define the entire history of American helicopters. The workhorses. The Bell H-13. Sioux is the helicopter most people picture when they think of the Korean War. Its defining feature was a bubble canopy, a round glass fishbowl cockpit sitting at the front of a thin, exposed tail boom. It had no enclosed cabin, no armor, and no weapons. What it had was the ability to get in fast, land almost anywhere, and get out. Wounded soldiers were strapped into stretchers mounted on the outside of the skids, fully exposed to freezing temperatures and rotor wash, and flown directly to surgical units. It was brutal, and it worked. The H-13 became the symbol of battlefield medical evacuation and saved thousands of lives in Korea. Most people don't know that the first U.S. president to ever fly in a helicopter didn't ride in a large, luxurious military transport. He rode in a modified Bell 47/H-13J Ranger. In 1957, Dwight D. Eisenhower boarded this small, enclosed cabin helicopter and landed on the White House lawn. That single moment changed the way the U.S. military and Secret Service thought about moving the president. The era of presidential helicopter transport had begun, and it started with a glorified bubble cockpit on skids. While the H-13 was gaining battlefield prominence, the Hiller OH-23 Raven was quietly doing the heavy lifting in Army training programs. It had a slightly wider cabin and used a unique rotor control system with paddle-shaped stabilizer blades that made it more forgiving and stable to fly. Thousands of pilots who would later fight in Korea and Vietnam learned the fundamentals of rotary flight in the Raven before they ever touched anything more advanced. The Piasecki H-21 Shawnee introduced a shape that nobody who saw it ever forgot. A bent, curved fuselage that earned it the permanent nickname, the Flying Banana. The curve wasn't aesthetic, it was engineering. By bending the rear of the fuselage upward, the rear rotor was lifted high enough off the ground to spin without striking anything during landing on uneven terrain. The H-21 was the first tandem rotor cargo helicopter, capable of operating in snow, swamps, and mountain terrain, putting troops exactly where conventional aircraft couldn't reach. The Sikorsky H-19 Chickasaw solved a problem that had limited every cargo helicopter before it. Where do you put the engine? Earlier designs placed the engine in the middle of the fuselage, eating directly into cargo space. Sikorsky moved the engine into the nose the way a truck engine sits up front, leaving the entire main cabin open and flat for troops or supplies. In Korea, this meant you could load a full infantry squad, fly them behind enemy lines, and have them on the ground and fighting within seconds. That capability, air assault, changed military doctrine permanently. The turbine revolution. The shift from piston engines to jet turbines didn't just make helicopters faster and more powerful. It made them lighter, more reliable, and capable of doing things that were physically impossible before. The first machine to showcase this in a truly unique way was the common H-43 Husky. It used intermeshing rotors, the same scissors blade configuration that Kellett had experimented with years earlier, but Kamen refined it into something stable and practical. The Air Force used it specifically for crash rescue at airfields. When a jet aircraft went down on the runway and caught fire, the Husky would hover directly over the burning wreckage and use the powerful downwash from its rotors to physically blast the flames away from the cockpit, buying the trapped pilot enough time to escape. Nothing in this entire history of American rotary flight comes close to the cultural and military impact of the UH-1 Iroquois, Huey. Everyone calls it the Huey, a nickname that came from its original designation HU-1 before the military renamed it. Its two-blade rotor produced a distinctive chopping, thumping sound that is instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever seen a Vietnam War film. That sound defined an entire era of warfare. The Huey did everything. It carried troops into landing zones under fire. It evacuated the wounded. It was stripped down and armed with rockets and machine guns to escort convoys. It was the cavalry horse of the 20th century, and over 16,000 were built. The original Huey ran on a single engine, and that created a specific problem. If that one engine failed, the helicopter went down with everyone on board. The Marines and Air Force pushed back hard on this. Their answer was the UH-1N Twin Huey. It featured a distinct flattened nose and a coupled twin engine system, meaning two engines shared a single transmission. If one quit, the other kept the aircraft flying. Beyond its combat roles, the twin Huey took on one of the most quietly important jobs in the American military, guarding nuclear missile silos across the Great Plains for decades, patrolling vast stretches of Montana and Wyoming, where Minuteman missiles sat waiting underground, naval, coast guard, and amphibians. Operating a helicopter over open ocean introduces a completely different set of problems compared to land-based operations. The aircraft needs to handle salt corrosion, land on moving decks, survive high winds, and in some cases, land directly on water. The machines built for this environment were engineered around those specific demands, and several of them became some of the most capable and distinctive helicopters ever built. The H-52A Seaguard was the first turbine-powered amphibious helicopter in American service. It had a boat-shaped hull built into its lower fuselage, which allowed it to land directly on water in conditions that would destroy a conventional helicopter. It looked wide and ungainly. Coast Guard crews called it the hunchback whale, but that shape was entirely functional. Over its service life, the Seaguard was credited with saving more than 15,000 lives, landing in open swells to pull sailors and fishermen directly from the water when no other aircraft could safely reach them. The SH-3 Sea King is remembered by most people for one specific image: Navy divers opening its side door to help astronauts climb out of a bobbing capsule in the Pacific Ocean after returning from space. The Sea King recovered the crews of Apollo missions throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, but its primary military mission had nothing to do with space. It was a submarine hunter. It carried dipping sonar, a long cable with a sensor at the end that could be lowered into the ocean while the helicopter hovered, along with torpedoes and depth charges. Its job was to find Soviet submarines operating beneath the surface and destroy them before they could launch. Rounding out the naval fleet is the S-61R/HH-3F Pelican. Unlike the naval Sea King, the S-61R featured a rear loading ramp and a fully watertight hull, combining the cargo-carrying capability of a transport helicopter with the ability to land on water. For 4 decades, it served as the Coast Guard's heavy amphibian, capable of loading survivors through the rear ramp while floating in open seas. It was eventually replaced by the Jayhawk, but during its service life, it handled rescue missions of a scale and complexity that no other helicopter in the fleet could have managed. The Air Force needed a version of the Sea King that could go deep into enemy territory to pull out downed pilots, and the result was the HH-3 Jolly Green Giant. where the Naval Sea King was designed for open ocean operations. The Jolly Green was armored, armed, and painted in dark green camouflage for jungle operations. It carried defensive guns, had armor plating protecting the crew, and was fitted with an aerial refueling probe that allowed it to take on fuel from a tanker aircraft without landing, extending its range deep into North Vietnam. When a pilot ejected over enemy territory, the Jolly Green came for him regardless of the threat level. Modern warfare and special ops. By the 1970s, the military had learned hard lessons from Vietnam about what a helicopter needed to survive in a modern war. The UH-60 Black Hawk was the direct answer to those lessons. It was designed from the ground up to be faster, stronger, and significantly harder to crash than the Huey it replaced. Its airframe was built to absorb impact in a way that gave the crew a survivable zone, even in a hard landing or a hit from ground fire. It could carry 11 combat-loaded soldiers, sling artillery pieces underneath, or be stripped out entirely for medical evacuation. It became the universal platform of the U.S. Army. If a job needed a helicopter, the Black Hawk was the starting point. While the Black Hawk handled transport, the Army needed something built purely to destroy things on the ground, specifically Soviet tanks. In a potential war in Europe, thousands of Warsaw-packed tanks would pour through mountain passes, and the military needed a helicopter that could stop them. The AH-64 Apache was that machine. It carried a 30mm chain gun mounted under the nose, and that gun was slaved directly to the pilot's helmet-mounted sight. Wherever the pilot looked, the gun pointed. It also carried Hellfire missiles, laser-guided weapons capable of destroying a tank from over 4 miles away. The Apache didn't just engage targets. It hunted them systematically using its sensors to find, identify, and eliminate armored vehicles before they even knew it was there. Operating in a completely different weight class was the MH-6 Little Bird. The Little Bird was small enough to land on a rooftop, a street corner, or the deck of a ship. Special operators didn't ride inside it. They sat on narrow external benches bolted to the sides of the aircraft, feet dangling in the open air, weapons ready. The moment the helicopter touched down, they stepped off and moved immediately. No ramp, no door, no delay. Just instant action from a machine that could get into spaces nothing else could reach. The helicopter began as an experiment, tethered to the earth. Today, it operates at the limits of what's possible, hovering in blizzards, diving through canyons, hunting in the darkness with sensors no one could have imagined a century ago. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more, hit the like button, and comment below to tell me which topic you want me to cover next.